Few events in sports produce more drama and excitement than the Summer Olympic Games. And while every set of games has their own story, the early modern Olympic Games had a drama all their own as the rules and events were still in flux. In 1904, the first of the modern Olympics to be held outside of Europe came to the American Midwest, where they had more than their fair share of both highs and lows. The Games of the Third Olympiad deserve to be remembered. In 1901, the still young International Olympic Committee had awarded the 1904 Olympics to the city of Chicago to be held in September 1904. The Games of the Third Olympiad would be the first Olympic Games held outside of Europe. However, they wouldn't go quite as originally planned. St. Louis, a growing city on the banks of the Mississippi River and seeking international attention, was hosting the Louisiana Purchase Exposition the same year. Largely the brainchild of David R. Francis, who had served as mayor of St. Louis, governor of Missouri, and secretary of the Interior, the exposition, commonly called the St. Louis World's Fair, was a massive endeavor. The 1,200-acre exposition, intended to celebrate the centennial of the Louisiana Purchase, was held largely in St. Louis's Forest Park, which had been opened in 1876 and was redesigned for the exposition by the famous landscape architect George Kessler. St. Louis had constructed Francis Field with a capacity of 19,000 for the event. Open from April 30th until December 1st, 1904, the exposition featured the participation of 62 nations, 43 U.S. states, and the federal government. The fair comprised more than 1,500 individual buildings interconnected by 75 miles of roads and walkways. A combination of a trade show, civic showpiece, and a monument to culture, along with more than a tinge of American pride, the fair featured spectacles like the world-famous Wanamaker Grand Court organ, still the world's largest fully functional pipe organ, and the beautiful Jim Key, the educated horse. Over its course, the exposition attracted nearly 20 million visitors to the city. And St. Louis didn't want competition in the form of another international event held so close by in Chicago, and so Francis set out to steal the 1904 Olympic Games from the city of Chicago. St. Louis essentially blackmailed the International Olympic Committee by planning to host its own athletic events opposite the Olympic Games, including a deal with the Amateur Athletic Union to host their track and field championships. At risk of having the Olympiad overshadowed, Pierre de Coubertin, the president of the International Olympic Committee, intervened and moved the Games to St. Louis. He was unhappy with the decision, as the 1900 Games had been held in Paris in conjunction with the Exposition Universelle, or the 1900 World's Fair. With the competition spread out over the course of 5 months, the Olympiad was overshadowed by the fair. No opening or closing ceremonies were held, and it was so unclear as to what competitions were and were not part of the Olympiad that some of the competition winners in 1900 didn't even know that they had participated in the Olympics. St. Louis appeared to be headed down the same path. De Coubertin was so unimpressed that he didn't even bother to come to St. Louis, and later wrote, "I had a sort of presentiment that the Olympiad would match the mediocrity of the town." If his assessment of St. Louis was uncharitable, de Coubertin's concerns were well-founded. The athletic competitions for the exposition were organized by James Edward Sullivan, founder of the Amateur Athletic Union. Sullivan planned to hold an athletic event for every day of the 7-month-long fair, diluting interest in specific events and again causing confusion as to exactly which events were and were not part of the Olympics. In a move that seems bizarre today, but was apropos to the time, Sullivan organized a set of events called Anthropology Days. So-called ethnological expositions, which were more commonly referred to as human zoos, were commonplace in the era of the turn of the century, as people of the period saw colonialism romantically as a civilizing force. Natives from around the world would be displayed in their natural setting as parts of circuses or zoos. These were very common at world fairs, as the themes usually referred to technological progress, and human zoos reinforced contemporary ideas of race, progress, and civilization. The St. Louis Louisiana Purchase Exposition was no exception. 1,400 people from Southeast Asia, the Pacific Islands, East Asia, Africa, the Middle East, South America, and North America participated in such anthropological exhibits as part of the fair, and hundreds more were in various other cultural exhibits. Working with renowned anthropologist William John McGee, Sullivan put together 2 days of sporting events in which some 100 men of the indigenous peoples from the fair were paid to participate. While the idea was essentially consistent with the contemporary philosophy of the Olympics, which were partially created because, as de Coubertin noted, organized sports could be a vigorous instrument of the disciplining of colonized peoples, it was controversial. not because of the racism that it implies today, but because, once again, it was unclear as to what was and was not an actual Olympic event. Some of the events, such as archery and javelin throwing, mimicked Olympic competition, but there were also supposedly native competitions like pole climbing and mud throwing. Despite his own comments about the civilizing force of competitive sport, de Coubertin derided the Anthropology Days as an outrageous charade. Despite the complaints that the Games would be overshadowed by the fair and it wasn't clear which events were actually Olympic events, the 1904 Games were not well attended internationally. In the era before air travel, it was expensive and difficult to get to St. Louis. World travel was already impacted by the Russo-Japanese War, and many Europeans were unfamiliar with American geography and assumed that St. Louis was lost somewhere in the dangerous American wildlands. While top-ranked athletes from the United States and Canada were present, less than 10% of the athletes in the competition hailed from outside North America, and only some 12 nations were represented. Unlike Paris 4 years before, St. Louis did at least host an opening ceremony, but it was poorly planned and lightly attended. Still, the Games included a number of innovations, including the first Games to include boxing, freestyle wrestling, weightlifting, which was then called dumbbells, team archery, a team fencing event, soccer, and the decathlon. The 1904 Games were also the first Games to feature lacrosse, including a Canadian team that was comprised entirely of members of the Mohawk people. Events were held in golf, which would not appear as an Olympic sport again until 2016. The Games included the sport of roque, a variant of croquet, and the diving event of plunge for distance, for the only times in Olympic history. The 1904 Games were one of only 5 Games that included tug of war as an Olympic sport. Demonstration sports, ones that aren't officially recognized as events, included the first appearance at the Olympics of the American sports of baseball, basketball, and American football, as well as female boxing, and the only ever occurrence in the Olympics of the Gaelic sport of hurling. While water polo was an event at the 1900 Games, it was considered an exhibition sport in 1904, and the results are not considered to be official by the International Olympic Committee. The 1904 Games were the last Olympic Games where all the officials came from the host nation, rather than using international judges, and were the first Games to award the now familiar gold, silver, and bronze medals for first, second, and third. There were several remarkable performances, despite a field that heavily favored Americans. Sprinter Archie Hahn, the Milwaukee Meteor, won the 60, 100, and 200-meter sprints, setting a record in the 200. German swimmer Emil Roche was the top-winning non-American athlete, medaling in 3 swimming events. Americans Martin Sheridan and Ralph Rose threw the exact same distance in the discus and had to have a throw-off to determine who won the gold. At the age of 71, American Thomas Foster Scott became the oldest man to ever participate in the archery event at the Olympics, while his daughter, Matilda Scott Howell, won 3 gold medals in archery, the only official event in 1904 that included female competitors. 2 teams of 3 women each competed. Indiana athlete Ray Uri, who had won gold medals in Paris for the events of standing high jump, standing long jump, and standing triple jump, successfully defended all 3 titles, bringing his number of Olympic gold medals to 6. While the standing triple jump was eliminated in the 1908 Summer Olympics, he successfully defended his titles in the standing long jump and the standing high jump. His record of 8 individual Olympic gold medals stood for 100 years and 23 days, until it was surpassed by swimmer Michael Phelps in 2008. His record of winning 3 gold medals in 2 different events stood for 116 years. He competed in 8 Olympic events over 3 games and won gold in all 8. Still the Olympic record for the most Olympic medals with a 100% record. Remarkably, Uri had been diagnosed with polio as a child and had taken up the jumping events to strengthen his legs. Perhaps the most astounding performance, however, came from German-American gymnast George Iser. Iser immigrated to the United States from Germany at the age of 13, eventually moving to St. Louis, where he competed in gymnastics with the St. Louis club, the Concordian Turnverein. During the Olympic Gymnastic Championships on October 29th, he won 6 medals, winning the parallel bars and rope climb, tying for gold in the vault, winning silver medals in the pommel horse and all-around, and bronze in the horizontal bar. While that is an impressive medal haul, it was, in Iser's case, even more impressive, as he had lost his lower left leg in an accident as a youth and was competing wearing a wooden prosthetic. He was the only athlete to have competed in the Olympic Games with a prosthetic leg until South African swimmer Natalie Dutoit competed in 2008. There were certainly scandals in the 1904 Games. In a bizarre display of poor sportsmanship, a boxer named James Bollinger entered under the false name of Carol Burton. Carol Burton was the name of a local St. Louis boxer, and Bollinger apparently thought using that name would curry favor with the local judges. He won his first match, but was then forced to forfeit when his ruse was found out. An artificial lake was created in Forest Park and used for swimming and water polo events. During some of the water polo games, livestock from the fair were allowed to use the opposite end of the lake. Within a year, 4 players from the water polo teams died of typhus, presumably from the agricultural pollution. By far, however, the oddest and most controversial event at the 1904 Olympics was the ancient event that virtually defines the Summer Olympics, the marathon. The controversy started with the course itself. Sullivan designed the 24.85-mile course over unpaved dirt roads with just one water stop at the 11-mile mark, ostensibly to conduct research on forced dehydration. It was, of course, a dangerous choice, as dehydration can be deadly. To make matters worse, the race was run in late August and started in the afternoon rather than the early morning. Temperatures were above 90 degrees with 90% humidity. Officials rode ahead of the runners in cars, which just stirred up choking dust on the dirt roads. The course included a number of hills with brutally long ascents. Only 14 of 32 entrants finished the race, the lowest percentage in Olympic history. San Franciscoan William Garcia passed out after 19 miles, having received internal injuries from breathing all the dust. Had he not been found by a bystander, he well could have died. 2 Swana tribesmen, part of the exposition's Boer War exhibit, ran representing South Africa, making them the first black Africans to participate in the modern Olympics. Both ran barefoot. They finished 9th and 12th, but the 9th place finisher, Len Tao, likely would have finished higher except that he was chased by a pack of stray dogs more than a mile off course. One of the strangest stories of the race was Cuban runner Andrin Carvajal. A postman, he had run the length of Cuba to raise money to come to the Olympics. But when he arrived in the U.S. in New Orleans, he lost most of his money gambling and had to hitchhike to St. Louis. He barely made it in time for the race and ran in his street clothes, having cut off his pants at the knees. He hadn't eaten in 40 hours and stopped to chat with spectators, purportedly stealing 2 peaches from passengers of a passing car. He came upon an apple tree and took some apples, which turned out to be rotten and caused him stomach cramps. He stopped and took a nap, but still managed to finish in 4th place. But the strangest stories came from the 2 men who were thought to win the race. New Yorker Fred Lors had done his training only at night, as during the day he was a bricklayer. During the terrible heat of the race, he gave up after 9 miles, and then rode in his trainer's car the next 11 miles. When the car broke down, he jogged the last 5 miles into the stadium, where he was mistaken for having finished the race. Alice Roosevelt, daughter of then-President Theodore Roosevelt, was about to lay the golden wreath on his head as the winner when members of the crowd protested. Lors insisted that he was joking, that he would not have really accepted first place. Then came British-born American Tom Hicks of Boston. Hicks had finished 2nd in the Boston Marathon the previous spring. Hicks had a 1.5 mile lead with 10 miles left in the race, but then he nearly collapsed, and his trainers prevented him from lying down. Instead, they fed him small doses of egg whites mixed with strychnine. Yes, rat poison. Strychnine in small doses is a stimulant, but in 1904 there were no rules against performance-enhancing drugs. As he neared the end of the race, he was hallucinating and could barely walk. Finally, his trainers carried him over the finish line, holding him in the air as his feet shuffled, and judges decided it was enough to count. By then, he had been given a near-fatal dose of poison, and it took doctors 4 hours to treat him before he could even leave the stadium. His winning time of 3 hours, 28 minutes, 45 seconds is the slowest winning marathon time in Olympic history, almost 30 minutes slower than the second slowest winning time. In the end, the United States dominated the Games, winning 239 out of 280 available medals, a point that is still a matter of some controversy today. But athletes such as George Iser, Ray Uri, Andrin Carvajal, and even Fred Lors, who won the 1905 Boston Marathon, went on to find a level of success that demonstrated that the 1904 Games had been well contested by top-level competitors. The 1904 Games provided valuable experience to the International Olympic Committee. They were part of the long process of standardizing rules and practices that defined the Olympics today. 4 years later, the Olympics would see another last-minute change of venue and still more controversy as the Olympic Games continued to produce history that deserves to be remembered. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy, short snippets of forgotten history between 10 and 15 minutes long. And if you did enjoy, please go ahead and click that thumbs up button. If you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes, please write those in the comment section. I will be happy to personally respond. Be sure to follow The History Guy on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and check out our merchandise on teespring.com. And if you'd like more episodes on forgotten history, all you need to do is subscribe.